Sarah Chen lifted another box of medical gauze from the pallet, her movements precise and deliberate as she arranged the supplies in the loading bay. Around her, the Portland Emergency Relief Distribution Center buzzed with frantic energy as volunteers scrambled to prepare earthquake relief shipments for Southern California. The concrete floors echoed with the sound of forklifts and shouting voices, but Sarah worked in focused silence, checking each medical kit against her clipboard with the thoroughness of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. "Hey, perfectionist!" Jake Morrison's voice cut through the warehouse noise as he strode over, his supervisor badge catching the fluorescent lights. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. We're loading disaster supplies, not performing surgery. Speed it up." His comment drew snickers from nearby volunteers who had been watching Sarah's methodical approach with growing impatience. She had been organizing the medical supplies for 3 hours now, triple-checking inventory lists and ensuring proper temperature controls for sensitive medications. "These antibiotics need specific handling protocols," Sarah replied without looking up from her checklist. Her voice was steady, professional, but Jake rolled his eyes dramatically for the benefit of his audience. "Listen, lady, I've been doing disaster logistics for 15 years. Military training, multiple deployments. I think I know how to load a truck." He gestured broadly at the chaos around them. "See everyone else? They're getting the job done while you're playing doctor with bandages." The laughter that followed was cruel but not unusual. Sarah had grown accustomed to being underestimated in the 6 months since she'd started working at the distribution center. To her coworkers, she was just another volunteer who took herself too seriously, someone who had probably watched too many medical dramas and thought she understood emergency response. They saw a quiet Asian woman in her 30s, who dressed conservatively, spoke softly, and seemed overly concerned with procedure. What they didn't see was the reason behind her precision, the knowledge that came from years of training they couldn't imagine. The morning had started like any other at the Portland facility. Sarah arrived early, as always, parking her modest sedan in the employee lot and entering through the side door that led directly to the warehouse floor. She preferred the early hours when the building was quieter, when she could review the day's shipment requirements without interruption. The earthquake had struck Los Angeles at 3 in the morning, a magnitude 7.2 that had left thousands homeless and overwhelmed the local medical infrastructure. Within hours, relief organizations across the Pacific Northwest had mobilized, and the Portland Center had become a critical hub for coordinating medical supply distribution. Sarah understood the urgency better than most, though she kept that understanding to herself. She had seen what happened when medical supplies were improperly handled, when medications lost their potency due to temperature exposure, when critical equipment was damaged because someone prioritized speed over proper protocol. The consequences weren't abstract to her. They were memories that visited her in quiet moments, faces of people who had depended on her expertise in circumstances far more dire than a warehouse in Portland. As the morning progressed and more volunteers arrived, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated by her own competence. When she suggested that the insulin shipments needed insulated containers, Jake dismissed her concerns with a wave. When she pointed out that the morphine inventory didn't match the shipping manifests, another supervisor told her to stop overthinking things. When she noticed that several boxes of surgical instruments had been exposed to moisture and recommended they be checked for sterility, the response was eye-rolling and muttered comments about overcautious civilians. The irony wasn't lost on her. In another life, in another context, these same people would have hung on her every word. They would have cleared rooms when she entered, implemented her recommendations without question, trusted her judgment with lives that couldn't be replaced. But that life had been erased so thoroughly that sometimes Sarah wondered if it had ever existed at all. The woman who had once briefed government officials and coordinated emergency responses in situations that most people couldn't imagine was now treated like an amateur who didn't understand the basics of disaster relief. The heat in the warehouse was oppressive, despite the industrial fans that churned the air overhead. The combination of summer temperatures and the exertion of loading heavy boxes had most workers stripping down to t-shirts, but Sarah kept her long-sleeved button-down shirt carefully in place. She had learned to dress defensively, to cover the evidence of a past that officially had never happened. The scar that ran along her left collarbone was distinctive enough that medical professionals would recognize it immediately. The particular pattern left by surgical pinning after a complex fracture, the kind of injury that required specialized treatment and left permanent markers. Emily Watson, a recent college graduate who had volunteered to help coordinate the relief effort, approached Sarah's station with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "Sarah, I'm sorry about Jake. He's been stressed about the deadline pressure from headquarters. They want these trucks loaded and on the road by noon." Sarah nodded without pausing in her work. "The medical supplies in Truck 3 aren't properly secured. The boxes will shift during transport and potentially damage the equipment inside." Emily glanced toward Truck 3, where other volunteers were rapidly stacking boxes with little attention to weight distribution or padding. "I'll mention it to Jake, but he's pretty focused on getting everything out quickly." "Speed doesn't matter if the supplies arrive damaged," Sarah said quietly, her hands never stopping their methodical arrangement of the medical kits. "These antibiotics will be useless if they're contaminated, and that defibrillator equipment needs shock-resistant packing." "How do you know so much about medical equipment?" Emily asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Sarah paused for just a moment before responding. "I read the handling instructions." It wasn't a lie, exactly, but it wasn't the truth either. The truth was that she had used equipment like this in conditions that would make a disaster zone look like a controlled environment. She had performed emergency medical procedures while under threat, had made decisions about medication protocols when standard medical infrastructure had completely collapsed, but that expertise was supposed to be buried, along with everything else from her previous life. As the day wore on, the criticism became more pointed. When Sarah took extra time to ensure that blood pressure monitors were properly calibrated, Jake made loud comments about efficiency. When she questioned whether certain expired medications should be included in the shipments, other volunteers laughed about perfectionism getting in the way of helping people. The subtext was clear. Who was she to second-guess experienced disaster relief workers? What medical training could a warehouse volunteer possibly have that would override the judgment of people who had been doing this work for years? Tom Bradley, a veteran relief worker with graying hair and tired eyes, watched the interactions with growing interest. He had been coordinating disaster response for 2 decades, had worked in enough crisis situations to recognize competence when he saw it. Sarah's questions weren't the product of overthinking. They were exactly the kinds of concerns that experienced medical professionals would raise. Her knowledge of equipment specifications and handling protocols went far beyond what any casual volunteer would possess. "You worked in medical supply before this?" Tom asked during a brief break, approaching Sarah as she reviewed shipping manifests. "Something like that," Sarah replied, not looking up from her paperwork. Tom studied her profile, noting the way she held herself, the unconscious authority in her movements, even when she was being dismissed by others. "You know, I've coordinated relief efforts in 12 states. I've worked with field medics, emergency room doctors, trauma specialists. You handle that equipment like someone who's used it for real." Sarah met his eyes for a moment before returning to her clipboard. The manuals are pretty detailed, but Tom wasn't convinced by the deflection. He had seen too many pretenders over the years, volunteers who talked a good game but didn't have the practical knowledge to back it up. Sarah was different. She had the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested under pressure and proven themselves capable. The way she checked medication expiration dates wasn't the behavior of someone reading instructions. It was the automatic response of someone who had been trained to know that details mattered when lives were at stake. The morning's loading operation continued with growing tension. Jake's frustration with Sarah's pace had infected other supervisors, and soon there was a general consensus that she was holding up the entire operation with unnecessary perfectionism. Comments grew louder and more pointed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Someone suggested that maybe Sarah would be better suited to office work where her attention to detail wouldn't slow down emergency response. Another volunteer joked that she should stick to organizing office supplies instead of medical equipment. Sarah absorbed the criticism without responding, continuing her methodical work even as the atmosphere around her grew increasingly hostile. She had learned long ago that defending herself only made things worse, that trying to explain her knowledge would raise questions she couldn't answer. The frustration was familiar, the knowledge that she could help more effectively if people would listen, balanced against the necessity of maintaining a cover that protected not just her but potentially many others. The warehouse temperature continued to climb as the morning progressed, and Sarah found herself constantly adjusting her sleeves to ensure they remained in place. The long-sleeved shirt was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, but the alternative was unthinkable. Discovery would mean questions, and questions would lead to investigations that could unravel carefully constructed protections that extended far beyond her own situation. "This is ridiculous," Jake announced to the group of volunteers gathered around Truck 2. "We've got a timeline to meet, and one person is holding up the entire operation because she thinks she knows better than everyone else." He gestured toward Sarah, who was carefully checking the seals on containers of controlled medications. "Lady, we're not running a pharmacy here. We're trying to get supplies to people who need them." The group's attention focused on Sarah, and she could feel the weight of their collective impatience. These were good people, volunteers who had given up their day to help earthquake victims, and she was making their job harder by insisting on procedures they didn't understand the importance of. The guilt was a familiar companion, the knowledge that doing things correctly often meant being seen as difficult, that her insistence on proper protocol was viewed as obstruction rather than protection. Emily Watson stepped forward, trying to mediate the growing conflict. "Maybe we could find a middle ground? Sarah clearly has experience with medical supplies, and Jake knows the logistics requirements. Could we work together instead of experience?" Jake interrupted with a laugh. "Reading the side of a box isn't experience. I've coordinated relief operations in 3 states. I know what I'm doing." Sarah straightened slowly, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. For a moment, Tom thought he saw something dangerous flicker in her eyes. Not anger exactly, but the kind of controlled intensity that came from someone who had been pushed too far. But then she took a breath and returned to her work, her voice carefully neutral. "The morphine in Container 7 isn't properly secured. If the truck hits a pothole, those vials will break and contaminate the entire shipment." "Enough!" Jake's voice echoed off the warehouse walls. "I've had it with your constant second-guessing. You're a volunteer, not the supervisor. Either load these supplies the way we tell you, or find somewhere else to help." The warehouse fell quiet except for the hum of the ventilation system. Even the most impatient volunteers seemed to recognize that Jake had crossed a line, that public humiliation wasn't an appropriate response to someone who was clearly trying to help. Sarah stood motionless for a long moment, her clipboard held loosely in her hands, and Tom found himself holding his breath. Then car doors slammed in the parking lot outside, and voices could be heard approaching the loading dock. Someone was arriving, though it wasn't clear who. Sarah glanced toward the entrance, and for just a moment, her carefully controlled expression faltered. Something about those approaching voices had affected her in a way that Jake's criticism hadn't. The warehouse's main entrance opened with a metallic screech, and 3 figures in professional attire entered the bustling space. Leading them was Dr. Marcus Rivera, his emergency response coordinator badge visible on his dark suit jacket. Behind him walked 2 assistants, carrying tablets and official-looking folders. Dr. Rivera's eyes immediately began scanning the operation, taking in the loading procedures and supply organization with the critical gaze of someone who understood that efficiency and accuracy weren't mutually exclusive concepts. Sarah's reaction was immediate and involuntary. Her clipboard slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering to the concrete floor. The color drained from her face as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Dr. Marcus Rivera, the colleague she hadn't seen in 5 years, the man who had been told she was dead, who had attended her memorial service and spoken at length about her contributions to medical emergency response. He was older now, gray, threading through his dark hair, but unmistakably the same person who had once been her closest professional ally. "Good morning," Dr. Rivera announced to the assembled volunteers, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Dr. Rivera from Regional Emergency Response. I'm here to inspect the medical supply distribution and ensure we're meeting federal protocols for disaster relief." Jake straightened immediately, his previous bravado replaced by nervous deference. "Of course, Doctor. We're running ahead of schedule, and everything is being handled according to standard procedures." Dr. Rivera nodded politely, but continued his visual assessment of the loading operation. His gaze swept across the various stations, noting the organization of supplies, the handling procedures being used, the general efficiency of the operation. When his eyes reached Sarah's station, they stopped. She was standing frozen beside her overturned clipboard, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Ma'am?" Dr. Rivera took a step in her direction, concern evident in his voice. "Are you all right?" Sarah couldn't respond. Her throat had closed completely, and she felt as though the warehouse floor was shifting beneath her feet. This wasn't supposed to happen. The careful distance she had maintained, the anonymous life she had built, it was all about to crumble because of a random inspection visit. Tom Bradley moved to Sarah's side, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. "She's been working hard all morning. Probably just needs some water." But Dr. Rivera wasn't convinced by the explanation. Something about the woman's reaction had triggered his attention, and he approached slowly, his medical training automatically assessing her condition. She was in some form of shock, but not from physical exertion. This was the response of someone who had seen something traumatic, someone whose carefully constructed world had just been disrupted. "Have we met before?" Dr. Rivera asked gently, stopping a few feet away from Sarah. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew she had to respond, had to say something that would deflect his attention and allow her to escape this situation. But her voice seemed to have abandoned her entirely, and she could only stare at the man who represented everything she had lost. Emily Watson, recognizing that something significant was happening, stepped forward with water bottle in hand. "Here, Sarah. You should sit down for a minute." "Sarah," Dr. Rivera repeated slowly, as though testing the name. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Tom could see recognition beginning to dawn in his expression. "Sarah Chen?" The use of her full name was like a physical blow. Sarah's knees buckled slightly, and Tom's grip on her arm tightened to keep her upright. Around them, the other volunteers had stopped their work to watch the unfolding drama, sensing that something important was happening, even if they didn't understand what. Dr. Rivera stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only Sarah could hear. "That's impossible. You're dead. I spoke at your memorial service." The words broke whatever control Sarah had been maintaining. Tears began streaming down her face, and she nodded slowly, unable to speak but confirming what Dr. Rivera had already realized. The woman standing before him was someone who had been erased from existence, someone whose death had been officially documented and grieved by colleagues who had never learned the truth. Jake Morrison watched the exchange with growing confusion and irritation. "Is there a problem here, doctor? Sarah's just a volunteer. She doesn't have any special medical training or anything." Dr. Rivera turned to look at Jake with an expression that could have frozen water. "This woman," he said quietly, "was one of the most skilled emergency medical specialists I've ever worked with. She coordinated disaster response in situations that you couldn't imagine." The warehouse fell completely silent. Even the mechanical sounds of the loading equipment seemed muted, as the implications of Dr. Rivera's words settled over the assembled volunteers. Sarah Chen, the perfectionist they had been mocking, the overcautious volunteer they had been dismissing, wasn't just someone who read medical equipment manuals carefully. She was someone whose expertise had been so significant that a regional emergency response coordinator, recognized her immediately after years of separation. Sarah finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Marcus, I can't. This isn't supposed to happen." "I know," Dr. Rivera replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "But here you are, alive, working disaster relief under a different name." He paused, his medical professional instincts taking over. "Are you safe? Are you in some kind of protective situation?" The question struck at the heart of everything Sarah had been trying to avoid. Safety was relative, and protection came at the cost of erasure. She had been safe as long as she remained invisible, as long as nobody connected her current identity with her previous life. But that safety had just been shattered by a chance encounter that was supposed to be impossible. Tom Bradley, who had been listening to the exchange with growing amazement, finally spoke up. "I knew it. I knew you had real medical experience. Nobody handles equipment like that without serious training." Jake Morrison looked between Sarah and Dr. Rivera with the expression of someone whose entire worldview was being forcibly rearranged. "I don't understand. If she's some kind of medical expert, why is she working as a volunteer in a warehouse?" Dr. Rivera's expression hardened as he turned to address Jake directly. "That's an excellent question, and I think the answer is going to be very interesting." He looked back at Sarah, his voice gentle but determined. "We need to talk. Privately. There are things I need to understand about how you ended up here." Sarah shook her head desperately. "You don't understand the situation. There are reasons why I can't. Why this has to stay quiet." "I understand more than you think," Dr. Rivera replied. "I know what happened at Mount Hood. I know about Project Sanctuary. And I know that the official report was a lie." The mention of Project Sanctuary hit Sarah like an electric shock. Her head snapped up, and for the first time since Dr. Rivera had entered the warehouse, she met his eyes directly. The name of the operation wasn't supposed to exist in any form that could be spoken aloud. The fact that he knew it, that he had just said it in front of witnesses, meant that everything she thought she understood about her situation was about to change. Emily Watson, who had been trying to follow the increasingly complex conversation, finally voiced what everyone was thinking. "What's Project Sanctuary?" Dr. Rivera and Sarah looked at each other for a long moment, and Tom could see some form of silent communication passing between them. Finally, Dr. Rivera turned to address the assembled volunteers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to need everyone to step away from this area for a few minutes. Official business." As the volunteers reluctantly moved toward other parts of the warehouse, Jake Morrison lingered, his supervisor instincts warring with his growing curiosity. "Doctor, I have a right to know what's happening in my facility." "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Rivera said with quiet authority, "what's happening here is far above your clearance level. I suggest you focus on your loading schedule and let me handle the situation." The dismissal was polite but absolute, and even Jake recognized that he was outranked. As he reluctantly joined the other volunteers at a distance, Dr. Rivera turned back to Sarah, who was now sitting on a nearby crate with her head in her hands. "How long have you been here?" he asked gently. 6 months, Sarah replied without looking up. "They gave me a new identity, a new background, told me to stay invisible and never contact anyone from before. They told me you died in the facility collapse," Dr. Rivera said. "Killed along with the rest of your team when the contamination breach triggered the emergency destruction protocol." Sarah laughed bitterly. "The facility didn't collapse. It was destroyed deliberately, but not because of contamination. We were getting too close to the truth about what was really being researched there." Dr. Rivera pulled up a nearby crate and sat down facing her. "Sarah, I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Because if you're alive, if the official report was fabricated, then there are implications that go far beyond just your situation." Sarah looked around the warehouse, noting that despite Dr. Rivera's dismissal, several volunteers were clearly straining to overhear their conversation. "Not here. Too many people." "Then where?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all seemed to lead to dangerous territory. Finally, she looked up at Dr. Rivera, with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. "There's a coffee shop, 2 blocks east of here. Giuseppe's. Can you meet me there in an hour?" Dr. Rivera nodded. "I'll be there." As he stood to leave, Sarah reached out and caught his arm. "Marcus, you have to understand, if this gets out, if the wrong people find out I'm alive, there are consequences beyond just my safety." "I understand," Dr. Rivera replied. "But Sarah, staying hidden isn't protecting anyone if the same things are still happening, if Project Sanctuary was just the beginning." The words hung in the air as Dr. Rivera collected his assistants and headed for the exit. Sarah watched him go, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences, none of which seemed to offer easy solutions. The carefully constructed life she had built was already starting to crumble, and she could feel the weight of decisions that would affect far more than just her own future. Tom Bradley approached cautiously as the official party left the building. "Sarah, I don't know what just happened here, but if you need help, if there's something you're dealing with that's bigger than you can handle alone, you don't have to face it by yourself." Sarah looked at him with gratitude, mixed with fear. "Tom, you have no idea what you'd be getting involved in." "Maybe not," Tom replied, "but I've been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone is being silenced for the wrong reasons. And whatever happened to you, whatever you were involved in, it's connected to the kind of medical expertise that could save lives if it wasn't being buried." Sarah stood slowly, her legs still unsteady. Around them, the warehouse was gradually returning to normal operations, though she could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations. The encounter with Dr. Rivera had changed everything, but the magnitude of that change was only beginning to become clear. As she bent to retrieve her fallen clipboard, Sarah's sleeve rode up slightly, exposing just the edge of the scar that ran along her collarbone. Tom's eyes caught the distinctive pattern immediately, the precise surgical markings of someone who had received emergency medical treatment under circumstances that left permanent evidence. "Sarah," he said quietly, "whatever that scar represents, whatever happened to put it there, I have a feeling the people who need to hear your story are finally ready to listen." Sarah pulled her sleeve back into place and looked toward the warehouse entrance where Dr. Rivera had disappeared. For the first time in 5 years, the possibility of speaking the truth seemed both terrifying and inevitable. The loading operation continued around them, but Sarah Chen was no longer just another volunteer being dismissed by her supervisors. She was someone whose expertise had been recognized, whose hidden past was beginning to surface, and whose carefully maintained silence was about to become something far more dangerous: the truth. Giuseppe's coffee shop sat tucked between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing boutique, its weathered brick facade and hand-painted sign giving it the appearance of a place that had been serving the neighborhood for decades. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table with clear sightlines to both entrances and positioning herself so her back was to the wall. Old habits died hard, and despite 5 years of civilian life, she still automatically assessed potential exit routes and maintained situational awareness that most people would find exhausting. The coffee shop was busier than she had expected for a Tuesday afternoon, filled with a mix of college students working on laptops, business people conducting informal meetings, and retirees reading newspapers. The ambient noise provided good cover for conversation, but Sarah found herself cataloging faces anyway, noting anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to their surroundings. Paranoia had become second nature during her years in hiding, and the morning's encounter with Dr. Rivera had activated every protective instinct she possessed. When Marcus Rivera entered exactly on time, Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite having expected him. He moved through the coffee shop with the same confident stride she remembered from their days working together, but there were subtle changes that spoke to the years that had passed. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, and there was a wariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He ordered a black coffee at the counter, his movements casual but alert, and Sarah realized he was conducting the same threat assessment she had performed earlier. "Sarah," he said as he approached her table, his voice carefully neutral. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "I'm not sure I had a choice," Sarah replied, gesturing for him to sit across from her. "The moment you recognized me, staying hidden became impossible." Marcus settled into his chair, wrapping his hands around his coffee cup, as though seeking warmth despite the summer heat. "I've been looking for you for 5 years. When they told me you were dead, when they showed me the facility destruction footage, I knew something was wrong. The official report didn't match what I knew about your capabilities or your team." Sarah studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. Trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford, and even with someone she had once considered a close friend, she needed to be cautious. "What made you suspicious?" "The timeline never made sense," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "They claimed the contamination breach happened at 0300 hours, but I knew your team's rotation schedule. You weren't supposed to be in the primary lab at that time. And the supposed contamination itself, the biological agent they claimed, caused the emergency destruction. I'd never seen anything like it in any of our research databases." Sarah felt a chill despite the warmth of the coffee shop. "You investigated the official report?" "Quietly. Very quietly. I made inquiries through channels that were supposed to be secure, tried to access backup data from the facility's research archives. Every time I got close to finding real information, I was transferred to a different project or given assignment that took me away from the investigation." "They were watching you," Sarah said, the pieces clicking into place. "Anyone who asked too many questions about Project Sanctuary was either reassigned or eliminated from the equation entirely." Marcus nodded grimly. "I started to realize that my continued employment was contingent on accepting the official narrative and not pursuing uncomfortable questions. But I never stopped wondering what really happened up there." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as though it might contain answers to questions she had been carrying for years. The weight of secrecy was exhausting, but the alternative, revealing the truth about Project Sanctuary, carried risks that extended far beyond her own safety. "Marcus, if I tell you what really happened, if I share what I know about the facility and the research we were conducting, there's no going back. The people who covered this up, who made me disappear, they have resources and motivation that haven't diminished over time." "I understand the risks," Marcus replied. "But Sarah, I've spent 5 years watching emergency response policies change in ways that don't make sense. New protocols that prioritize containment over rescue, research guidelines that seem designed to prevent certain types of investigation. If Project Sanctuary was connected to those changes, then staying silent isn't protecting anyone." Sarah looked around the coffee shop again, noting the steady flow of customers and the background noise that would make electronic surveillance difficult. Making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying, she began to speak. "Project Sanctuary wasn't a standard medical research facility. We were told it was focused on developing emergency response protocols for biological threats. But the real research was much more specific. We were working on countermeasures for weaponized pathogens, agents that had been engineered to be resistant to conventional treatments." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. "Weaponized pathogens. You're talking about biological weapons research." "Defensive research," Sarah corrected. "At least, that's what we were told. My team was responsible for developing rapid response medical protocols for scenarios where traditional hospitals and emergency services had been compromised. We were creating mobile treatment units, emergency surgical procedures that could be performed in contaminated environments, medication protocols that could be administered by non-medical personnel." "But you discovered something else," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question." Sarah nodded slowly. "The pathogens we were developing countermeasures for, they weren't foreign weapons or naturally occurring threats. They were being created in the same facility where we were working. We weren't just preparing for biological attacks. We were enabling them." The implications of her words settled over the table like a physical weight. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, his coffee forgotten as he processed what she had revealed. You're saying Project Sanctuary was developing biological weapons under the cover of defensive research? I'm saying we were unknowingly part of a dual-use program, Sarah replied. Every countermeasure we developed, every emergency protocol we created, was also information that could be used to maximize the effectiveness of the weapons themselves. If you know exactly how medical personnel will respond to a biological attack, you can engineer your weapon to be most effective against those responses. Marcus ran his hands through his hair, the gesture revealing the stress he was feeling. Sarah, what you're describing isn't just a cover-up. It's a violation of international law, domestic oversight protocols, and basic ethical standards for medical research. I know, Sarah said quietly. And when my team started to piece together what was really happening, when we began asking questions about the source of the pathogens we were supposed to be defending against, that's when everything went wrong. The afternoon sun streaming through the coffee shop windows cast long shadows across their table, and Sarah found herself remembering another afternoon 5 years ago when she had sat in a similar establishment with her research partner, Dr. James Liu, discussing their growing concerns about the direction of their work. That conversation had set in motion a series of events that had cost 5 lives and erased her from existence. Tell me about the day everything changed, Marcus said gently. Sarah closed her eyes, the memories flooding back with painful clarity. It was a Tuesday, just like today. We had been working on a particularly virulent strain, something that appeared to be a modified version of a hemorrhagic fever virus. The official briefing materials claimed it was based on intelligence about a foreign weapons program, but James had been running genetic analysis on the samples. Dr. Liu found something in the genetic structure. He found markers that indicated the virus had been created in an American laboratory. Not just any laboratory, our laboratory. The genetic signatures were consistent with research that had been conducted in the lower levels of the facility, in sections that were supposedly focused on agricultural pest control. Marcus shook his head in disbelief. They were creating the weapons and the countermeasures simultaneously. Exactly. And when James brought his findings to me, when we started comparing notes with other team members, we realized the scope of what was happening was much larger than we had imagined. Dr. Ana Rodriguez had been noticing discrepancies in the medical supplies we were requisitioning, quantities that didn't match the research protocols we were following. Kevin Park had been asked to develop surgical techniques for treating injuries that were suspiciously specific to the effects of the pathogens we were studying. Your entire team was beginning to understand the real nature of the project, Marcus said. We were, Sarah confirmed, and we made the mistake of thinking we could address it through official channels. James submitted a formal inquiry about the genetic analysis results. Anna filed a report about the supply discrepancies. Kevin requested a meeting with the facility director to discuss the ethical implications of the surgical protocols. And that's when they decided you were a threat. Sarah nodded, her voice becoming even quieter. Within 72 hours, we received new assignments that would have split up the team. James was being transferred to a facility in Alaska. Anna was being reassigned to a project in Maryland. Kevin was being moved to a private contractor position that would have required him to sign additional non-disclosure agreements. They were breaking up your team to prevent you from coordinating further investigation, but we had already shared too much information with each other, Sarah continued. We knew that separating us wouldn't make the ethical problems disappear. It would just make them harder to document and report. So we made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, but turned out to be catastrophic. Marcus waited for her to continue, sensing that they were approaching the heart of the story. We decided to gather comprehensive evidence before we were separated. James made copies of his genetic analysis data, and documented the supply discrepancies. Kevin recorded detailed notes about the surgical protocols, and Lisa Turner used her access to the facility's communication systems to copy relevant email exchanges and internal memos. You were building a case for whistleblowing. We were trying to do the right thing, Sarah said, her voice carrying years of regret. We thought if we could present a complete picture of what was happening, if we could show that the research was being conducted without proper oversight and in violation of international agreements, that responsible officials would intervene and correct the situation. Instead, you triggered a response that was designed to eliminate the threat you represented. Sarah's hands tightened around her coffee cup. The facility's security protocols included provisions for dealing with what they called insider threats. Staff members who posed risks to operational security could be dealt with through a variety of means, ranging from reassignment to more permanent solutions. Permanent solutions, Marcus repeated, his voice filled with horrified understanding. The contamination breach was real, Sarah continued, but it wasn't accidental, and it wasn't caused by a failure of safety protocols. It was a deliberate release designed to create a scenario where the facility would need to be destroyed, along with everyone inside it. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. Marcus loosened his tie and leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, you're telling me that your entire team was murdered to prevent you from exposing the weapons research? 4 of my team members were killed in the initial contamination release, Sarah replied. The pathogen was designed to be rapidly fatal, and they were in the primary lab when it was released. I was in the communications center with Lisa, trying to send our evidence to external contacts, when the emergency alerts started. How did you survive? Lisa had been monitoring the facility's internal communication systems as part of her evidence gathering. She intercepted the order to initiate the contamination protocol before it was implemented. We had maybe 5 minutes to react before the release occurred. Marcus stared at her, processing the implications. You knew it was coming. Lisa knew, Sarah corrected. She saw the electronic authorizations being transmitted, recognized what was about to happen, and managed to get us into the facility's emergency isolation chamber before the contamination was released. But the isolation chamber was only designed to protect against accidental exposure, not deliberate release of a weaponized pathogen. But you survived. Barely. The isolation chamber's air filtration system wasn't designed to handle the concentration of pathogen that was released. We were exposed to sublethal doses, enough to make us seriously ill but not enough to kill us immediately. Lisa died from the exposure after 18 hours. I survived because I was able to administer emergency medical treatment to myself using supplies that were stored in the isolation chamber. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what Sarah was telling him. And then I had to make a choice. I could try to escape the facility and report what had happened, knowing that doing so would likely result in my death and accomplish nothing since all the evidence had been destroyed. Or I could accept the cover story that was being constructed and disappear into a new identity. They offered you a way out. The cleanup team that arrived at the facility included personnel who specialized in managing situations where witnesses needed to be either eliminated or co-opted. They presented me with documentation showing that Sarah Chen had died in the contamination event, along with identity documents for a new person who could live a quiet life somewhere far from the research community. And you accepted. I accepted because I was injured, alone, and facing people who had just demonstrated their willingness to kill an entire research team to protect their secrets. I accepted because I believed that surviving and possibly finding a way to expose the truth later was better than dying immediately and accomplishing nothing. Marcus nodded slowly. But you've been hiding for 5 years. What changed? Why are you willing to talk about this now? Sarah looked around the coffee shop, noting that the afternoon crowd was beginning to thin out. Because this morning, when I was working in that warehouse, I realized that staying silent isn't protecting anyone anymore. The earthquake relief operation we were supporting, the medical supplies we were loading, they're being distributed according to protocols that prioritize containment over treatment. The same mentality that created Project Sanctuary is influencing emergency response policies that affect thousands of people. You think the weapons research is continuing? I think the research was never stopped, just moved and restructured. The people who were willing to kill my team to protect their secrets didn't just abandon the project because one facility was destroyed. They learned from what happened and made sure their next iteration would be more secure. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Sarah, if you're right, if Project Sanctuary was just one component of a larger program, then the implications are staggering. We're talking about a systematic effort to develop biological weapons under the cover of defensive research, with built-in methods for eliminating anyone who threatens to expose the truth. And the people responsible for that program are still in positions of authority, Sarah added. They're still making decisions about research priorities, emergency response protocols, and oversight procedures. My silence hasn't prevented them from continuing their work. It's just made it easier for them to operate without scrutiny. So what do we do? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the pedestrians passing by on the sidewalk. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their safety might depend on decisions being made by individuals who had already demonstrated their willingness to sacrifice lives for strategic advantage. We gather evidence, she said finally, but we do it carefully, and we do it smart. The people who created Project Sanctuary have had 5 years to improve their security measures and eliminate potential threats. If we're going to expose what they're doing, we need to be prepared for the fact that they'll try to stop us. Marcus nodded. I have contacts in oversight agencies, people who might be willing to listen if we can provide compelling evidence. And I have knowledge of their methods and procedures, Sarah replied. I know how they operate, how they think, and what kinds of evidence they'll try to destroy or discredit. This is dangerous, Sarah. If they were willing to kill your team to protect their secrets 5 years ago, they'll be willing to kill again. I know, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear she was feeling. But Marcus, I've been living with the knowledge that my silence enabled them to continue their work. I've been carrying the guilt of knowing that my survival came at the cost of allowing them to potentially harm many more people. I can't do that anymore. Marcus reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. Then we do this together. But we do it carefully, and we do it with proper precautions. The first thing we need to do is document everything I remember about Project Sanctuary, Sarah said. Facility layout, research protocols, personnel names, administrative procedures, everything that might help identify where the program was relocated. And I need to review the policy changes I've been tracking, Marcus added. If there are connections between Project Sanctuary and current emergency response protocols, we need to identify them and understand how they're being implemented. Sarah pulled out her phone and checked the time. I should get back to the warehouse. If I'm gone too long, people will start asking questions. What about your cover identity? Are you safe continuing to work there? For now, Sarah replied. But that situation is going to become more complicated quickly. Jake Morrison and the other supervisors know that you recognized me as someone with significant medical expertise. They're going to start asking questions about my background that I can't answer honestly. We could arrange for you to be transferred to a different position, Marcus suggested. Something that would put you closer to policy development and give you access to current research priorities. That might work, Sarah agreed. But it would also put me in contact with people who might recognize my previous work or connect me to Project Sanctuary. It's a risk either way, Marcus said. But if we're going to gather evidence about current operations, we need someone on the inside who understands what to look for. Sarah stood up, gathering her purse and preparing to leave. Marcus, there's something else you need to know. When I was working in the warehouse this morning, when I was being criticized for my attention to medical protocol details, I realized that the people making those criticisms didn't understand why those details mattered. They were treating emergency medical supplies like generic cargo, without regard for the specific handling requirements that could mean the difference between life and death. You think that's connected to Project Sanctuary? I think it's connected to the same mentality that created Project Sanctuary, Sarah replied. A willingness to treat human lives as acceptable losses in pursuit of strategic objectives. If that mentality is influencing emergency response policies, then the number of people potentially affected is much larger than just the research staff who were killed at the facility. Marcus nodded grimly. Then we need to move quickly. The longer we wait to gather evidence and present it to the appropriate authorities, the more people could be affected by policies that prioritize containment over human welfare. I'll start documenting everything I remember about Project Sanctuary tonight, Sarah said. Facility details, research protocols, personnel information, administrative procedures. Everything that might help identify connections to current operations. And I'll begin reviewing the policy changes I've been tracking, Marcus replied. If there are patterns that connect to Project Sanctuary methodologies, we need to identify them as quickly as possible. As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and relief that was almost overwhelming. For 5 years, she had carried the burden of knowledge about Project Sanctuary alone, believing that silence was the only way to protect herself and others. Now, for the first time since the facility's destruction, she had an ally who understood the magnitude of what they were dealing with. The walk back to the warehouse gave Sarah time to think about the implications of what she had revealed to Marcus. By sharing her knowledge of Project Sanctuary, she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The people responsible for the program would eventually learn that she was alive and talking, and when they did, they would respond with the same ruthless efficiency they had demonstrated 5 years ago. But the alternative, continuing to remain silent while potentially harmful policies were implemented, was no longer acceptable. The morning's encounter at the warehouse had shown her that her medical expertise was needed, that her knowledge could make a difference in situations where lives were at stake. Hiding that expertise to protect herself was a form of complicity that she could no longer justify. When Sarah returned to the warehouse, she found that the loading operation had continued in her absence, but with noticeably less efficiency. Several of the medical supply containers had been improperly secured, and she could see that temperature-sensitive medications had been left exposed to heat sources that could compromise their effectiveness. Tom Bradley approached her as she signed back in at the volunteer station. "Sarah, we need to talk. Since you left with Dr. Rivera, there have been some developments." "What kind of developments?" Jake Morrison received a call from someone claiming to be from the State Emergency Management Office. They were asking questions about the medical supply handling procedures being used at this facility, and specifically about staff members who had been raising concerns about protocol compliance. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's air conditioning. Did Jake give them any specific information? He mentioned that one of the volunteers had been insisting on medical protocol requirements that seemed excessive for disaster relief operations. He didn't give your name, but he described the situation in enough detail that anyone listening would be able to identify you. How long ago was this call? "About an hour ago," Tom replied. "Sarah, I don't know what you're involved in, but I've been doing disaster relief work for 20 years, and I've never had state officials call to ask about individual volunteer behavior. This isn't normal." Sarah looked around the warehouse, noting the positions of security cameras and the locations of exits. Her conversation with Marcus had apparently attracted attention more quickly than she had anticipated. "Tom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are you willing to help me with something that could be dangerous?" Tom studied her expression, noting the seriousness in her voice. "That depends on what kind of help you're talking about. The kind that involves documenting evidence of wrongdoing by people who have significant resources and few ethical constraints," Sarah replied. "The kind that could put you at risk if the wrong people find out you're involved." Tom was quiet for a moment, weighing the implications of what she was asking. "Sarah, I've spent 2 decades watching good people get hurt because bureaucrats make decisions based on politics instead of human welfare. If you're trying to expose that kind of corruption, then yes, I'm willing to help." "Then we need to be very careful about how we proceed," Sarah said. "Because the people we're dealing with have already demonstrated their willingness to kill to protect their secrets." As the afternoon sun began to set outside the warehouse windows, Sarah realized that her carefully constructed life of anonymity was coming to an end. The choice now was whether that end would come on her terms or on the terms of the people who had tried to erase her 5 years ago. The loading operation continued around them, but Sarah's attention was focused on the subtle changes she was beginning to notice in the warehouse's normal routine. New faces among the volunteers, people who seemed more interested in observing than in working. Security procedures that had been relaxed that morning were now being more strictly enforced. "Tom," she said quietly, "I think we need to leave." "Now?" "Now," Sarah confirmed. "Because I don't think we're going to get another chance." As they walked toward the exit, Sarah's mind was already racing through the implications of what she had set in motion. The conversation with Marcus had been necessary, but it had also triggered a response that was going to force her to make decisions she had been avoiding for 5 years. The war between truth and secrecy was about to begin, and Sarah Chen was no longer going to be a bystander. The drive to Tom Bradley's house took them through residential neighborhoods that Sarah had never seen before, tree-lined streets with modest homes that spoke of families and stability. As they sat in Tom's living room an hour later, surrounded by 20 years of disaster relief memorabilia and family photographs, the contrast between this normal domestic space and the conversation they were about to have felt surreal. Tom's wife, Linda, had taken their teenage daughter to soccer practice, leaving the house quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. Tom poured coffee from a pot that had been brewing since they arrived, his movements careful and deliberate as he processed what Sarah had begun to tell him during the drive. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Tom said, settling into his recliner with his coffee cup balanced on the armrest. "You're telling me that the medical research facility where you worked was deliberately destroyed to cover up an illegal biological weapons program, and that your entire research team was murdered to prevent them from exposing what was happening?" Sarah nodded, her hands wrapped around her own coffee cup for warmth, despite the summer heat outside. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, and the people responsible for that program are still in positions of authority, still making decisions that affect emergency response policies and medical research priorities." Tom shook his head slowly, his expression reflecting the difficulty of accepting such a devastating reality. "Sarah, what you're describing isn't just criminal conspiracy, it's terrorism. Domestic terrorism conducted by government officials against their own research staff." "I know how it sounds," Sarah replied. "I know how impossible it seems that something like this could happen within our own institutions. But Tom, I lived through it. I watched my colleagues die, I barely survived myself, and I spent 5 years hiding from the people who were responsible." "And you think they're still active? Still conducting this kind of research?" "I think the program was too valuable to them to simply abandon after one facility was compromised," Sarah said. "The research we were conducting had applications beyond just biological weapons. The medical countermeasures we developed, the emergency response protocols we created, the rapid treatment procedures we designed, all of that has legitimate value for disaster response and emergency medicine." Tom leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "But it also has value for anyone who wants to understand how to maximize the damage caused by biological attacks." "Exactly. Every countermeasure we developed was also a roadmap for how to defeat those countermeasures. Every emergency protocol we created was information that could be used to disrupt emergency response systems." The dual-use nature of the research made it incredibly valuable to people with questionable motives. "And you think Marcus Rivera can help you expose this?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "Marcus has access to policy development processes and oversight mechanisms that I don't. He's been tracking changes in emergency response protocols that might be connected to Project Sanctuary research. If we can demonstrate that current policies are being influenced by weaponized research methodologies, we might be able to build a case that responsible officials would have to investigate." "But you're also taking a huge risk by involving him," Tom pointed out. "If the people responsible for Project Sanctuary discover that you're alive and talking to someone in an official capacity, they'll respond accordingly." "They'll respond regardless," Sarah replied. "The moment Marcus recognized me in the warehouse, the situation changed. There's no going back to anonymity now. The question is whether we can gather enough evidence to protect ourselves by making the truth public before they can silence us." Tom stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his quiet neighborhood street. "Sarah, I've been involved in disaster relief for 2 decades. I've seen bureaucratic incompetence, political interference, and resource misallocation. But what you're describing goes beyond anything I've encountered. I know it's hard to believe. It's not that I don't believe you," Tom said, turning back to face her. It's that the implications are so staggering that I'm having trouble processing them. If you're right, if there's an active biological weapons program operating under the cover of legitimate research, then every emergency response operation could potentially be compromised. Sarah nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm worried about. The policies that govern how medical supplies are handled, how contamination events are managed, how emergency personnel are trained, if those policies have been influenced by people who are thinking about weaponized scenarios rather than purely defensive ones, then the responses themselves could be counterproductive. Like what happened at the warehouse this morning, Tom said, understanding beginning to dawn in his expression. The way Jake Morrison and the other supervisors were dismissing your concerns about medical protocol compliance. They weren't dismissing my concerns because they were wrong, Sarah explained. They were dismissing them because the current training emphasizes speed and volume over accuracy and safety. That prioritization makes sense if your goal is to move supplies quickly, but it doesn't make sense if your goal is to ensure that those supplies remain effective when they reach people who need them. Tom returned to his chair, his expression thoughtful. But it would make sense if your goal was to create protocols that would be less effective in a biological attack scenario. Or if your goal was to gather data about how emergency response systems react under pressure, Sarah added. Every disaster relief operation generates information about response capabilities, resource allocation, communication protocols, and system vulnerabilities. That information has value to people who might want to disrupt those systems in the future. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Tom's cell phone buzzing on the coffee table. He glanced at the display and frowned. "It's Jake Morrison," he said, looking at Sarah with concern. "He's calling my personal number." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Don't answer it." "If I don't answer, he'll know something's wrong," Tom replied. "Let me see what he wants." Tom accepted the call and put it on speaker. Jake's voice filled the room, tense and agitated. "Tom, where are you? We had some officials from the State Emergency Management Office show up here asking about Sarah Chen. They want to interview her about her background and her concerns about our medical supply protocols." "What kind of officials?" Tom asked, his voice carefully neutral. They had credentials and everything, but something felt off about them. They were asking very specific questions about her behavior, her knowledge of medical equipment, her interactions with Dr. Rivera. And Tom, they knew things about her that weren't in any of our volunteer records. Sarah gestured for Tom to keep Jake talking while she moved to the window to look out at the street. A dark sedan with tinted windows had parked across from Tom's house while they had been talking. "What kind of things did they know?" Tom asked. They knew she had worked with medical equipment before, they knew she had specific expertise in emergency response protocols, and they seemed to know that Dr. Rivera had recognized her from a previous professional relationship. "Tom, how could they know that stuff unless they had been monitoring our facility?" Tom looked at Sarah, who was now peering through the curtains at the sedan. She held up 2 fingers, indicating that she could see 2 people sitting in the front seats of the vehicle. "Jake, where are these officials now?" "They left about 30 minutes ago. But they said they'd be back tomorrow with additional personnel. They want to conduct a full review of our medical supply handling procedures and interview all the volunteers who worked with Sarah." "Did they leave contact information?" "They gave me a card, but when I tried to call the number to ask some follow-up questions, it went to a generic voicemail system that didn't identify any specific agency." Sarah moved away from the window and gestured for Tom to end the call. The situation was escalating more rapidly than she had anticipated. "Jake, I need to go. I'll call you back later," Tom said, disconnecting the call before Jake could respond. "They're here," Sarah said quietly. "There's a car across the street with 2 people in it. They've been there since Jake started talking about the officials who visited the warehouse." Tom moved to the window and looked out cautiously. "How do you know they're connected to this situation?" "Because I've seen this before," Sarah replied. "The same type of vehicle, the same surveillance pattern. This is how they operate when they're preparing to take someone into custody." "What do we do?" Sarah was already moving toward the back of the house. her mind automatically shifting into the survival mode that had kept her alive 5 years ago. We leave. Now, is there a back exit that doesn't go past that car? Tom nodded, leading her through the kitchen toward a door that opened onto his backyard. There's a gate that leads to the alley behind the house. My neighbor's yard connects to the street 1 block over. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus Rivera. The message was brief but alarming. Emergency meeting compromised. They know you're alive. Get somewhere safe. Tom, we need to move fast, Sarah said, showing him the message. Marcus is in trouble too. They slipped out through Tom's back door, moving quickly across the yard toward the neighbor's property. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that provided some concealment as they made their way through residential backyards toward the street where Tom had parked his truck that morning. As they reached Tom's vehicle, Sarah's phone rang. The caller ID showed Marcus Rivera's number, but when she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't Marcus. Dr. Sarah Chen, the voice said, crisp and professional. This is Director Patricia Holmes with the Pacific Northwest Medical Research Institute. I believe you know why I'm calling. Sarah's blood ran cold. Director Holmes was a name she recognized from Project Sanctuary, not someone who had worked at the facility directly, but someone who had been involved in the administrative oversight of the program. I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah replied, gesturing for Tom to start the truck. Dr. Chen, let's not waste time with denials. Dr. Rivera has been taken into protective custody for his own safety, and we need to arrange the same protection for you. There are people who would prefer that the events at the Mount Hood facility remain buried, and your recent decision to discuss those events with unauthorized personnel has created a security situation. Where is Marcus? Dr. Rivera is safe and will remain so as long as you cooperate with our security protocols. We need to meet to discuss your situation and determine the best way to ensure your continued safety. Tom had started the truck and was pulling away from the curb, heading in the opposite direction from his house. Sarah could see the dark sedan in the rearview mirror beginning to follow them. I'm not interested in meeting with you, Sarah said. Dr. Chen, you don't understand the gravity of your situation. The people who authorized the destruction of the Mount Hood facility are still active, and they view your survival as an ongoing threat to national security interests. If you don't accept our protection, you'll be vulnerable to more permanent solutions to the problem you represent. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Sarah looked at Tom, who was monitoring their pursuers while navigating through residential streets. What do you want? We want to arrange a debriefing session where you can share what you remember about Project Sanctuary in a controlled environment. We want to ensure that any information you possess is properly classified and that you understand the ongoing security requirements associated with that information. You want to silence me. We want to protect you, Director Holmes replied, but that protection is contingent on your cooperation with security protocols that are designed to prevent unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Tom turned onto a busier street, and Sarah could see that they were being followed by multiple vehicles now. The situation was becoming untenable. I need time to think about this, Sarah said. I'm afraid time is a luxury we don't have, Dr. Chen. The longer you remain unsecured, the greater the risk to all parties involved. We can arrange to meet you at any location you choose, but that meeting needs to happen within the next few hours. Sarah ended the call without responding and turned to Tom. They have Marcus, and they're not going to stop following us until we agree to meet with them. What do they really want? They want to determine how much I remember about Project Sanctuary and how much I've shared with other people. Then they want to ensure that I can't share any more information in the future. Tom checked the rearview mirror again. How do they ensure that? The same way they ensured it with my research team 5 years ago, Sarah replied grimly. The pursuit continued through Portland's evening traffic, with their followers maintaining a careful distance but never losing sight of Tom's truck. Sarah realized that the people tracking them were professionals who had resources and coordination capabilities that far exceeded what she and Tom could match. Tom, there's something I need to tell you. If we're going to have any chance of surviving this situation, I need you to understand exactly what we're dealing with. What haven't you told me? The people who destroyed Project Sanctuary, who killed my research team, who made me disappear, they're not just government officials operating outside their authority. They're part of a coordinated program that has been operating for years, possibly decades. The biological weapons research at Mount Hood was just one component of a much larger operation. Tom glanced at her while maintaining his focus on the road. How much larger? Large enough to have infiltrated multiple agencies, large enough to have ongoing operations at facilities across the country, and large enough to have eliminated dozens of people who posed threats to their security over the years. Jesus, Sarah, you're talking about a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of government. I'm talking about a parallel structure within the government that operates with minimal oversight and unlimited resources, Sarah replied. A structure that was created to pursue strategic objectives that couldn't be achieved through normal channels. The conversation was interrupted by another call from Director Holmes. This time, Sarah let it go to voicemail. When she listened to the message, the tone had shifted from professional courtesy to barely concealed threat. Dr. Chen, your refusal to cooperate is creating complications that extend beyond your personal situation. Dr. Rivera's continued safety depends on your willingness to participate in the debriefing process. Additionally, there are other individuals whose security could be compromised if classified information continues to be shared with unauthorized personnel. The implication was clear. Tom and anyone else who had been exposed to information about Project Sanctuary were now potential targets. They're threatening you, Sarah told Tom after playing the message. Let them, Tom replied, his jaw set with determination. I've spent 20 years watching bureaucrats make decisions that hurt innocent people. If this is my chance to help expose something that could prevent that kind of harm in the future, then it's a chance worth taking. Sarah looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. Tom, you don't understand what you're signing up for. These people don't make empty threats. And you don't understand what you're underestimating, Tom replied. I may not have your medical expertise or government experience, but I've been working in disaster relief long enough to know how to operate in dangerous situations. I'm not going to abandon you just because things are getting complicated. As they continued driving through Portland's streets, Sarah began to formulate a plan that was both desperate and potentially suicidal. If Director Holmes and her associates were determined to silence everyone who knew about Project Sanctuary, then the only defense was to make the information public before they could be stopped. Tom, do you have contacts in the media? People who would be willing to publish a story about government-sponsored biological weapons research. I know some investigative journalists who work on government accountability stories, Tom replied. But Sarah, if we're going to make this information public, we need more than just your testimony. We need documentation, evidence that can be independently verified. I know where to find that evidence, Sarah said, but getting to it is going to require us to do something incredibly dangerous. What do you have in mind? We need to go back to Mount Hood, Sarah said. Back to the site where Project Sanctuary was located. The facility was destroyed, but there are backup storage sites in the area where additional research data was maintained. If those sites are still intact, they would contain documentation that could prove everything I've been telling you. Tom stared at her in disbelief. Sarah, you're talking about returning to the exact location where they tried to kill you 5 years ago. That's not dangerous. That's suicidal. It's the only way to get evidence that would be credible enough to force an official investigation, Sarah replied. Without documentation, everything I've told you is just the testimony of someone who officially doesn't exist. With documentation, it becomes a provable case of criminal conspiracy. The pursuit behind them continued as they debated their options, and Sarah realized that they were rapidly running out of alternatives. Director Holmes and her team weren't going to stop following them, and eventually they would be forced into a confrontation that they couldn't win through conventional means. Tom, I need you to make a decision. Are you willing to help me try to expose this conspiracy, knowing that doing so will put your life at risk? Or do you want me to arrange for you to be left out of this situation while I try to handle it alone? Tom was quiet for a long moment, checking the rearview mirror and noting that their pursuers were still maintaining their careful distance. "Sarah, you said that these people killed your entire research team to prevent them from exposing Project Sanctuary." "That's right. And you think they'll kill us if we try to gather evidence about their ongoing operations?" "I think they'll kill us regardless," Sarah replied. "The difference is whether we accomplish something useful before they do." Tom nodded slowly. "Then we go to Mount Hood." As they changed direction and headed toward the interstate that would take them east into the mountains, Sarah felt a mixture of fear and determination that was becoming familiar. For 5 years, she had survived by avoiding confrontation and maintaining anonymity. Now, she was deliberately seeking confrontation, in the hope that exposure might provide protection. The dark sedan and its companion vehicles followed them onto the interstate, maintaining their surveillance as the convoy headed toward a confrontation that would determine not just Sarah's fate, but potentially the fate of anyone who might be affected by the ongoing biological weapons research that Project Sanctuary had represented. Behind them, the lights of Portland began to fade into the distance, and ahead of them, the mountains waited with secrets that had been buried for 5 years but never forgotten. The drive toward Mount Hood took them through increasingly remote terrain, past small towns, and into forested hills where cell phone coverage became sporadic, and the possibilities for escape or rescue diminished with each mile. Sarah found herself remembering the last time she had made this journey, 5 years ago, as part of a research team that had no idea they were driving toward their own deaths. The facility that had housed Project Sanctuary had been built in a remote location specifically to minimize the risk of public exposure, situated in a valley that was accessible only through a single mountain road and surrounded by national forest land that provided natural isolation. The official story was that the location had been chosen for its environmental isolation, which would prevent accidental contamination in the event of a research accident. The real reason was that it would be easier to eliminate witnesses if the facility's true purpose was ever discovered. As their convoy climbed into the mountains, Sarah's phone rang again. This time, the caller was Marcus Rivera, and his voice carried stress that was clearly audible. "Sarah, where are you?" "Marcus, are you all right? They told me you had been taken into protective custody." "I'm in federal detention at a facility outside Portland. They're claiming it's for my own protection, but I'm not allowed to leave, and my communications are being monitored." "Sarah, you need to know that they've been tracking your movements since this morning." "I know. We're being followed by multiple vehicles right now." "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "I've been able to access some limited information about current operations. Project Sanctuary wasn't terminated when the Mount Hood facility was destroyed. It was relocated and expanded. There are currently at least 3 active research sites conducting similar work." Sarah felt her stomach drop. 3 sites? Alaska, Montana, and New Mexico. All in remote locations, all operating under the same cover story about defensive biological research. "Sarah, the program has grown significantly since Mount Hood. They're not just developing weapons and countermeasures anymore. They're testing deployment methods and studying population response patterns." "Testing deployment methods," Sarah repeated, the implications becoming clear. "They're conducting actual biological attacks to test their weapons. Small-scale, isolated populations, events that can be explained as natural disease outbreaks or contain contamination incidents. But yes, they're moving beyond research into operational testing." Tom, who had been listening to the conversation, pulled off the main road onto a smaller Forest Service road. "Sarah, if they're conducting active testing, then every biological outbreak, every unexplained disease cluster, every contamination event could potentially be connected to their program." "That's exactly what I'm afraid of," Marcus continued. "And Sarah, there's something else. The people who are pursuing you aren't just trying to silence you to protect past operations. They're trying to silence you to protect ongoing operations that are scheduled to be implemented soon." "What kind of operations?" I don't have specifics, but I've seen references to something called Operation Clean Slate. It appears to be a large-scale deployment planned for a major population center, designed to test both weapon effectiveness and emergency response capabilities simultaneously. Sarah closed her eyes, the magnitude of what Marcus was telling her almost too overwhelming to process. When? The documents I was able to access suggested a timeline measured in weeks, not months. Sarah, if you're going to try to expose this program, you need to do it immediately. The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah and Tom to sit in silence on the Forest Service road while they processed what they had learned. Behind them, the pursuit vehicles had stopped on the main road, apparently waiting to see what direction their targets would take. Sarah, Tom said finally, if Marcus is right, if there are active biological weapons testing programs and they're planning a major deployment, then we're not just trying to expose a historical conspiracy. We're trying to prevent an active attack. I know, Sarah replied, and that means we can't just gather evidence and turn it over to journalists. We need to find a way to disrupt their operations directly. How do we do that? Sarah looked up at the mountain peaks that surrounded them, remembering the layout of the area where Project Sanctuary had operated. The backup storage sites I mentioned, they're not just repositories for research data. They're also communications hubs that coordinate between the different research facilities. If we can access those systems, we might be able to identify the locations of the current operations and potentially disrupt their communications. And if we can't, then we document everything we find and make it public, regardless of the consequences to ourselves. Because if Operation Clean Slate is implemented, the number of people who could be affected makes our personal safety irrelevant. Tom restarted the truck and began driving deeper into the mountains, following Forest Service roads that would take them toward the area where Project Sanctuary had operated. Behind them, the pursuit vehicles followed at a distance, apparently content to track their movements without immediate intervention. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah began to recognize landmarks that brought back memories of her final days at the facility. The road they were following would eventually lead to the valley where the main research complex had been located, but the backup sites were scattered throughout the surrounding hills and locations that had been chosen for their concealment and defensibility. The first backup site is about 2 miles ahead, Sarah told Tom. It's built into a hillside and designed to look like a natural rock formation. The entrance is concealed behind a screen of trees and requires access codes that I hope are still valid. What if the codes have been changed? Then we try to find another way in, Sarah replied, because this might be our only chance to gather the evidence we need to stop Operation Clean Slate. As they approached the coordinates Sarah remembered, the forest around them grew thicker, and the road became little more than a dirt track. The backup site had been designed to be accessible only to personnel who knew exactly where to look, and Sarah found herself hoping that her memory of the location was accurate. When they finally stopped the truck and began hiking through the forest toward the hidden entrance, Sarah could hear the sound of vehicles stopping on the road behind them. Their pursuers were no longer content to simply follow at a distance. "They're coming," Tom said, checking behind them as they climbed through the undergrowth. "Then we need to move fast," Sarah replied, "because once we're inside that facility, we'll either find what we need to stop them, or we'll be trapped with nowhere to run." The race to reach the backup site before their pursuers could catch them had begun, and Sarah realized that the next few hours would determine not just their own fate, but potentially the fate of thousands of people who had no idea they were about to become test subjects in a biological weapons experiment that had been 5 years in the making. The backup facility entrance was exactly where Sarah remembered it, concealed behind a cluster of Douglas fir trees and camouflaged with artificial rock facing that blended seamlessly with the natural hillside. As they approached the hidden doorway, Sarah could hear voices echoing through the forest behind them. Their pursuers had left their vehicles and were now tracking them on foot through the increasingly dense underbrush. Tom pressed himself against the artificial rock face, while Sarah located the concealed keypad that controlled access to the facility. Her fingers moved automatically through the sequence she had memorized 5 years ago, muscle memory overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze her rational thinking. The electronic lock cycled through its authentication process, with a series of soft beeps that seemed unnaturally loud in the forest silence. "Please still work," Sarah whispered, as the final authentication sequence completed. The concealed door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a corridor lined with stainless steel and illuminated by emergency lighting that cast harsh shadows on the walls. The air that flowed out of the facility carried the antiseptic smell of a medical laboratory mixed with the ozone scent of electronic equipment that had been operating continuously for years. "Jesus," Tom breathed as they stepped inside and the door sealed behind them. "This place is still active." Sarah nodded grimly as they moved through the entrance corridor toward the main operations center. The backup facilities were designed to operate independently for extended periods. They have their own power generation, air filtration, and communication systems. Even if the main facility was destroyed, these sites would continue functioning. The operations center was larger than Tom had expected, filled with banks of computer servers, communication equipment, and monitoring stations that displayed real-time data from locations across the country. Multiple screens showed what appeared to be epidemiological tracking information, population density maps, and atmospheric dispersion models that could only have one purpose. "Sarah, look at this," Tom said, pointing to a display that showed a detailed map of Los Angeles with overlay graphics indicating wind patterns, population concentrations, and what appeared to be optimal release points for an airborne contaminant. Sarah moved to the nearest computer terminal and began accessing the system using login credentials that she hoped were still valid. The security protocols recognized her biometric identifiers and granted access to files that contained more information than she had dared to hope for. "Tom, this is incredible. They've documented everything. Research protocols, testing results, operational planning documents, personnel records, budget allocations, oversight reports. Everything we need to prove that Project Sanctuary was just the beginning of a much larger program." The sound of voices in the corridor outside the operations center indicated that their pursuers had found the facility entrance and were now inside the complex. Sarah worked frantically to download as much information as possible while Tom positioned himself near the entrance to monitor their approach. "How much more time do you need?" Tom asked, hearing footsteps getting closer. "I need at least 10 more minutes to download the operational planning documents for Clean Slate," Sarah replied without looking up from the computer terminal. "But I don't think we have 10 minutes." The footsteps stopped outside the operations center, and both Sarah and Tom could hear muffled voices conferring about how to proceed. The facility's security systems had apparently sealed the operations center when unauthorized personnel entered the complex, buying them precious additional time, but also trapping them inside with no alternative exit route. Director Patricia Holmes's voice came through the intercom system that connected all areas of the facility. "Dr. Chen, I know you're in there. This facility is completely isolated and secure. There's no way for you to leave without our cooperation, and there's no way for you to communicate with the outside world from inside the complex." Sarah continued downloading files while responding to the director's ultimatum. "Director Holmes, I'm not interested in negotiating with people who murdered my research team. Dr. Chen, you're operating under some serious misconceptions about what happened at Mount Hood. Your research team wasn't murdered. They were casualties of a containment failure that was caused by their own unauthorized activities." "That's not true, and you know it," Sarah replied, her fingers moving rapidly across the keyboard as she accessed increasingly classified files. "I was there. I saw the authorization codes for the deliberate contamination release. I know that the pathogen was engineered specifically to be lethal, and that the emergency destruction protocol was triggered to eliminate witnesses. What you saw were emergency response measures designed to prevent a catastrophic outbreak," Director Holmes continued. "The research your team was conducting had become unstable, and when Dr. Liu began unauthorized genetic modifications, he created a pathogen that posed an immediate threat to public safety." Tom looked at Sarah with confusion. Is there any possibility that she's telling the truth? Sarah shook her head without pausing in her work. James Liu was one of the most careful researchers I've ever worked with. He would never have conducted unauthorized modifications, and he certainly wouldn't have created anything that posed a public safety risk. She's trying to rewrite history to justify what they did. The download progress indicator showed that Sarah was approximately halfway through copying the files she needed, but the voices outside the operations center were becoming more urgent, and she could hear what sounded like equipment being moved into position. Dr. Chen, Director Holmes continued, we're prepared to offer you the same protection arrangement that we offered 5 years ago. A new identity, relocation to a safe area, and financial support in exchange for your cooperation with ongoing security requirements. What kind of security requirements? Sarah asked, stalling for time while the file transfer continued. Non-disclosure of classified information, periodic debriefings about your activities and contacts, and agreement to avoid involvement in research or emergency response activities that might compromise operational security. You want me to disappear again. We want you to live quietly and safely without posing a threat to national security interests, Director Holmes replied. Dr. Chen, the research being conducted at our current facilities serves legitimate defensive purposes. The countermeasures we're developing could save thousands of lives in the event of a biological attack. Then why the secrecy? Tom called out, his voice carrying clearly through the intercom system. If the research is legitimate, why kill people to protect it? And you are? Tom Bradley. I work disaster relief, and I've seen the results of the policies your people have been implementing. Medical supply protocols that prioritize containment over treatment, emergency response procedures that seem designed to make disasters worse instead of better. Director Holmes was quiet for a moment before responding. Mr. Bradley, you're not qualified to evaluate the strategic considerations that inform policy development. The procedures you're criticizing are based on classified threat assessments that take into account scenarios you're not cleared to know about. Scenarios like biological weapons attacks that you're planning to conduct yourselves? Tom replied. The silence that followed Tom's accusation was longer and more ominous than Director Holmes's previous pauses. When she finally responded, her tone had shifted from professional courtesy to barely controlled hostility. Mr. Bradley, you've just made an accusation that constitutes a serious threat to national security. I'm afraid your involvement in this situation has moved beyond what can be resolved through negotiation. Sarah's download was now at 75% completion, but she could hear the sound of drilling equipment being used on the operations center door. Their pursuers were no longer content to wait for cooperation. Tom, they're cutting through the door. We need to find another way out of here. Tom began examining the operations center for alternative exits, while Sarah continued downloading files. The facility had been designed with security as a primary consideration, and the operations center appeared to have been built as a secure room with limited access points. Sarah, there's a ventilation shaft in the ceiling, but it's pretty small. I'm not sure we could both fit through it. What about the computer systems? Is there a way to transmit this information to someone outside the facility? Sarah checked the communication systems and discovered that the facility maintained secure connections to multiple external networks, including internet access that could potentially be used to upload the stolen files to public servers. I can upload these files to a journalist's secure server, Sarah said, beginning the upload process while the download continued. But it's going to take time, and they're almost through the door. The drilling sounds stopped, and Director Holmes's voice returned to the intercom system with a new urgency. Dr. Chen, you have 30 seconds to open this door voluntarily. After that, we'll be forced to use methods that won't guarantee your safety. Sarah looked at the progress indicators for both the download and upload processes. The download was at 90% completion, but the upload had barely begun. She would have to choose between getting complete information and ensuring that some information reached the outside world. Tom, if something happens to me, you need to make sure people know about Operation Clean Slate. It's a planned biological attack on Los Angeles scheduled to happen within the next few weeks. Nothing's going to happen to you, Tom replied, but his voice carried doubt that he couldn't entirely conceal. Promise me, Sarah insisted, as she initiated an emergency upload of the partial files to 3 different servers simultaneously. "Promise me that you'll find a way to warn people." "I promise," Tom said, moving to stand beside her at the computer terminal. The operations center door exploded inward with a blast that filled the room with smoke and debris. Through the haze, Sarah could see figures in tactical gear moving into the space, with weapons drawn and military precision that spoke to extensive training and experience. "Step away from the computer," a voice commanded as laser sights painted red dots on both Sarah and Tom. Sarah's hands remained on the keyboard, continuing to type commands even as the tactical team surrounded them. The upload progress indicator showed 20% completion, but the process was proceeding too slowly to finish before she was forced to stop. "Dr. Chen, step away from the computer immediately or we will be forced to use non-lethal restraint methods." "The upload is almost finished," Sarah said without moving. "Just give me 2 more minutes." "You don't have 2 more minutes," Director Holmes said as she entered the operations center behind the tactical team. "And Mr. Bradley, you're going to discover that involving yourself in this situation was a serious mistake." Tom stepped forward, placing himself between the tactical team and Sarah. "Director Holmes, if you're really conducting legitimate defensive research, then you should welcome public scrutiny. The fact that you're willing to kill people to prevent oversight suggests that your activities aren't as legitimate as you claim." "Mr. Bradley, legitimate defensive research sometimes requires methods that the public wouldn't understand or approve of. The threats we're preparing to defend against are sophisticated enough that our countermeasures must be equally sophisticated, including conducting biological attacks on your own citizens to test your weapons," Sarah asked, her fingers still moving across the keyboard as the upload continued. "Including conducting controlled exposures under carefully monitored conditions to validate the effectiveness of our countermeasures," Director Holmes replied. "Every medical intervention requires testing, Dr. Chen. The difference between our testing and conventional medical testing is that we're testing countermeasures for weapons that could kill thousands of people." The upload progress indicator reached 40% completion, but Sarah could see that the tactical team was preparing to physically remove her from the computer terminal. In desperation, she began typing commands that would initiate an automated upload process that would continue even if she was prevented from actively managing the transfer. "The Los Angeles operation isn't a test," Sarah said as she typed. "You're planning to release a biological weapon in a major population center to create a crisis that will justify expanded biological defense programs and increased security measures." Director Holmes's expression didn't change, but her silence was confirmation enough for both Sarah and Tom. "That's exactly what you're planning," Tom said. "You're going to kill innocent people to justify your own existence. We're going to save innocent people by developing the capabilities necessary to respond to biological threats that already exist," Director Holmes replied. "The threats are real, Mr. Bradley. Foreign governments and terrorist organizations are actively developing biological weapons. Our choice is to be prepared to respond to those threats or to accept that thousands of people will die when those weapons are deployed." "But you're not just preparing to respond to threats," Sarah continued, the upload now at 60% completion. "You're creating the threats yourselves so that you can justify the responses." The tactical team moved forward to forcibly remove Sarah from the computer terminal, but Tom stepped between them, using his larger frame to block their access. "Tom, don't," Sarah said. "They'll hurt you." "Dr. Chen, Mr. Bradley," Director Holmes said with visible impatience. "This situation has gone far beyond what can be resolved through discussion. The information you've accessed is classified at levels that require us to take measures to prevent its unauthorized disclosure." "Even if that means killing more innocent people?" Tom asked. "Even if that means protecting national security interests that are more important than individual lives," Director Holmes replied. The admission was exactly what Sarah had been hoping to record. The upload process had been capturing not just the stolen files but also the audio from their conversation with Director Holmes, creating a complete record of both the documentary evidence and the verbal confirmation of the conspiracy. Upload complete, Sarah announced as the progress indicator reached 100%. Everything we've discussed, everything I've downloaded, everything you've just admitted, it's all been transmitted to journalists, government watchdog organizations, and congressional oversight committees. Director Holmes's composure finally cracked. That's impossible. This facility's communication systems are secured and monitored. Your security systems were designed 5 years ago, Sarah replied. I've had 5 years to think about how to circumvent them. The tactical team immediately moved to the computer terminals, but Sarah had already logged out and initiated security protocols that would prevent unauthorized access to the systems. The upload had been completed using hidden network pathways that bypassed the facility's standard monitoring systems. Director Holmes, one of the tactical team members, said, "We're receiving reports that classified documents are being published on multiple public servers simultaneously." Director Holmes stared at Sarah with a mixture of fury and grudging admiration. "Dr. Chen, you've just committed treason against the United States. I've just prevented a terrorist attack against American citizens," Sarah replied. The fact that the terrorists were government employees doesn't change the nature of what they were planning. Tom moved closer to Sarah as the tactical team began coordinating their response to the information leak. "What happens now?" "Now we find out whether the American people care enough about the truth to demand accountability," Sarah said. Director Holmes activated her communication device and began issuing orders to personnel at other locations. All current operations are suspended pending security review. Operation Clean Slate is postponed indefinitely. All research staff are to report to designated secure facilities for debriefing. "It's over?" Tom asked. "This part is over," Sarah replied. "But the larger battle is just beginning. They'll try to discredit the information, claim it's fabricated or taken out of context. They'll try to prosecute us for espionage or treason. They'll try to rebuild their program with better security measures. But people will know the truth." "Some people will know the truth," Sarah corrected. "Whether that's enough people to create lasting change remains to be seen." As federal agents began arriving at the facility to take Sarah and Tom into custody, news organizations across the country were beginning to report on the massive document leak that detailed a secret biological weapons program operated by the United States government. The evidence was so comprehensive and well documented that even the most skeptical journalists were forced to take the revelations seriously. Within hours, congressional leaders were demanding immediate investigations. International organizations were calling for inspections of American research facilities, and protest demonstrations were beginning to form outside government buildings in major cities. Sarah Chen, who had spent 5 years hiding from the people responsible for murdering her research team, found herself at the center of a controversy that would ultimately reshape American policy regarding biological weapons research and government accountability. The woman who had been dismissed as an overcautious volunteer worker in a disaster relief warehouse had exposed one of the most significant government conspiracies in modern American history. The scar on her collarbone, which had nearly cost her life 5 years earlier, had become the key to preventing a biological attack that could have killed thousands of people. As Sarah was led away in federal custody, she reflected on the words her colleague Warren McRae had written in his final letter. "Stay loud, stay stubborn, and if you can, go back in and change the script." She had kept her promise to Warren and to the others who had died at Project Sanctuary. The script had been changed, and the silence that had protected a murderous conspiracy had finally been broken. 3 months later, Sarah Chen stood in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., preparing to testify before a joint congressional committee investigating the biological weapons program that had operated under the cover of Project Sanctuary and its successor operations. The charges against her for espionage and unauthorized disclosure of classified information had been dropped after public pressure made prosecution politically untenable. Director Patricia Holmes and 17 other officials had been indicted on charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to violations of international biological weapons treaties. The 3 active research facilities that Marcus Rivera had identified were closed and their research materials secured under international supervision. Tom Bradley had become a prominent advocate for transparency in emergency response policies, using his experience to push for reforms that would prevent the kind of manipulation that had influenced disaster relief protocols for years. Marcus Rivera had been released from detention and was now working with congressional investigators to identify other government programs that might be operating without proper oversight. The Los Angeles attack that had been planned as Operation Clean Slate never occurred, and the countermeasures that would have been tested during the attack were revealed to be far less effective than the public had been told. As Sarah took her seat at the witness table and prepared to tell her story one final time to the American people, she touched the scar on her collarbone and remembered the colleagues who had died because they believed that truth was more important than convenience. Their deaths had not been in vain. The truth had finally emerged, and the people responsible for burying it were now facing the consequences of their actions. But Sarah also knew that vigilance would be required to ensure that similar programs didn't emerge in the future. The willingness to sacrifice individual lives for strategic objectives was a temptation that would always exist within government institutions, and only constant public oversight could prevent that temptation from becoming policy. The fight for transparency and accountability was never truly over. It was a responsibility that each generation had to accept and fulfill, regardless of the personal cost. Sarah Chen had accepted that responsibility when she agreed to testify about Project Sanctuary. She had kept her promise to remember the dead and to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. And in doing so, she had proven that even the most powerful conspiracies could be defeated by individuals who were willing to risk everything for the truth. The woman who had been laughed at for loading supplies too carefully had saved thousands of lives by refusing to stay silent when silence was the easier choice. Her collarbone scar would always remind her of the price that truth sometimes demanded, but it would also remind her that paying that price was the only way to ensure that the truth survived. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.